She was just 6 years old. Yet kings gazed at her like she wasn't even human. She wore velvet, ate like royalty, lived in gold-lined halls. But behind her eyes was a silence so loud, it still echoes today. This isn't just the story of a little girl. It's the story of how power turns pain into spectacle, and how one painting exposed the monstrous truth behind the crown. Once you hear what they did to her, you won't look at history the same way again. Palitas vir main I chodius I larky high, surf six sol key, gol matalchera, I classical pose, lekin ankine, Udas, Jays kuchkana chadi ho, dusritas vir main wohi larky high, is dafa shai libas main, lail velvet ka joda, scenari kinari se sajahwa, harchis main nawabi shan high, magarchair ki ways. Yes surf paintings naidine, yet a sawalat they, jo son ka frame main band car daige they, JIS artist any yebanai, Juan Carreño de Miranda, Batshaka court painter. Lekin asal wazanuski brush main nahi. Us shaksiat main the jaise us and paint kia. Lekin yalarki county. Or AC udasi kasaf yuse, hum sha kuliya kenamar kar diagaya. Spain's golden throne didn't just sit on power. It rested on the bones of broken bloodlines. While Eugenia's painted eyes stared down from palace walls, another pair of eyes ruled from the shadows, pale, tired, and cursed by inheritance. Charles II became king in 1665. He was just 4 years old, but along with the crown, he inherited something far heavier, generations of inbreeding that had twisted the Habsburg bloodline into tragedy. His body was frail, his mind clouded, his nickname across Europe, El Hechizado, the Bewitched, and yet, in that fragile shell lived a powerful curiosity. He wasn't drawn to generals or gold. He was obsessed with the strange, the rare, the different. But where did this fascination lead? What kind of king doesn't crave conquest, but craves the abnormal? Charles's deepest obsession wasn't war. It was people. People who looked like no one else. People like Eugenia. Far from the marble halls of Madrid, in the dusty plains of Extremadura, a little girl was growing, and so was a mystery the world wasn't ready for. While King Charles was trapped in his palace of power and pain, Eugenia Martinez was born into a world of silence and soil. The year was 1674. Her parents were poor farmers, hands calloused, clothes torn, and barely enough bread to survive. But their newborn daughter? She was unlike any child they had seen. By the time she was 6, Eugenia weighed nearly 70 kilograms. She couldn't hide in a crowd. She was the crowd. Doctors today might call it Prader-Willi syndrome, or perhaps severe childhood obesity. But back then, there were no names, just stares and rumors. She became the talk of her village, a living riddle in a world that didn't understand difference. Whispers followed her wherever she went, but soon those whispers turned into footsteps, because the king's scouts had started listening. When poverty knocks and royalty is listening, even love has a price. Word of Eugenia traveled fast, faster than her parents could imagine. By the late 1670s, royal agents were roaming the countryside, not for treasure, but for curiosities, spectacles, oddities that could feed the king's restless eyes. And when they saw Eugenia, they didn't see a child. They saw something rare. For her parents, starving, desperate, exhausted, the offer was life-changing. A single payment, more than they'd earn in years. Gold in exchange for a daughter they could no longer afford to feed. And just like that, Eugenia's fate was sealed. She left the fields behind and entered the king's palace. No more dirt floors. No more hunger. Now, she had velvet sheets, satin shoes, tables overflowing with food. But comfort came with a cost. Because she hadn't been adopted into royalty. She'd been acquired, fed like nobility, dressed like a doll, shown off like a masterpiece. But no one, not one soul, looked into her eyes to see the child behind the costume. Eugenia didn't walk into a palace. She stepped into a cage, one made of silk and silence. When Charles II looked at her, he saw something strange. But maybe he also saw himself. The girl now lived in a palace. But she wasn't treated like royalty. She was brought out for guests. paraded at banquets, whispered about in corners. And the king? He couldn't look away. Charles II, fragile in flesh, broken in blood, stood face to face with a child who didn't fit the world around her. Maybe he saw in Eugenia a reflection, not just of physical difference, but of isolation, of being stared at, never understood. He ordered something no king had ever requested before. She must be painted. Immediately, the task fell to Juan Carreño de Miranda, master of royal portraiture. He'd painted dukes, queens, bishops, but never this. Never a girl brought to court not for power, but for spectacle. The painter stood before Eugenia, brush in hand, canvas blank. But what he would create would be more than a portrait, because when the painting was unveiled, it wouldn't just capture a child. It would expose a kingdom's quiet cruelty to the eyes of the world. When the portrait was revealed, the room went silent. Some stared in awe. Others turned away in horror. Juan Carreño de Miranda didn't flinch. He painted Eugenia as she was, fully, honestly, and without embellishment. No crown, no costume, just a child standing alone. The painting was raw. Her body, round and heavy for her age, stood firm against a dull, empty backdrop. But it wasn't her size that struck people the hardest. It was her expression. Eugenia's eyes stared from the canvas with quiet despair. There was no joy, no wonder, only a deep sadness, like she understood everything, but had no words for it. The court titled it La Monstrua Desnuda, the naked monster. A name that mocked her, a name that history would not forget. Yet within that cruel title, something else was captured, a moment of accidental truth. The artist had seen her, not as a creature, but as a person. Those eyes, they seemed to ask a silent question no one at court had the courage to answer. Why am I here? Soon, the king would commission a second portrait, this time dressed in red velvet and gold lace. Eugenia would become a fashion icon across Europe, but still just as caged, only now in finer clothes. Silk on her skin, velvet on her frame, but no fabric in the world could cover what she felt inside. After the raw honesty of La Monstrua Desnuda, the court decided something had to change. Not her life, just her image. And so came the second portrait. In this one, Eugenia stood tall in a crimson velvet outfit. Gold lace lined her sleeves. Her shoes glistened. Every stitch screamed royalty. A child dressed not for comfort, but for spectacle. The painting was titled La Monstrua Vestida, the dressed monster. A label soaked in irony, because though the dress had changed, the message hadn't. She was still being shown off, still being talked about, pointed at, whispered around, still not asked what she felt. The image spread across Europe. Noble families ordered copies. Art collectors displayed her like a curiosity, frozen in time. But the girl inside the painting? She hadn't changed. Behind the fine clothes and royal posture, her eyes told the same silent story. This isn't luxury. This is loneliness in disguise. She dined on golden plates, slept beneath silk canopies, and heard laughter, not with her, but at her. Eugenia had everything a common child could never dream of. Spain's richest food was served to her daily. Her quarters were laced with velvet and trimmed in gold. Tailors made her custom dresses fit for princesses, but she wasn't one. She was the court's curiosity, an ornament in human form. And everyone, nobles, ambassadors, visiting aristocrats, wanted to see the girl they called La Monstrua. Banquets were held in her presence. Guests chuckled. Some stared in silence. Others whispered crude remarks while she stood right there, listening, probably understanding more than they thought she could. She was not a performer, but they treated her like a circus act. And the court? They made sure she was always available, always visible, always on display. But novelty fades. Spectacles get old. And the real question began to stir. What happens to a human showpiece when the court gets bored? Eugenia's image didn't disappear. It exploded. Paintings of her traveled beyond Spain, across Europe, where she became not just famous, but pitted, a symbol of royal cruelty, hiding behind velvet robes. Her name echoed through the halls of Europe. Every noble had heard of her, But not one ever truly listened. Fame had stretched far beyond the palace walls. Eugenia's face had become a symbol, a curiosity catalogued in noble letters and painted in cold oil. But inside the palace, she was shrinking, not in size, but in spirit. She was surrounded by people, yet always alone. No friendships, no tutors, no playmates, just servants who bathed her, dressed her, positioned her when guests arrived. Her days were filled with abundance, food, fabric finery, but no affection. No one asked her how she felt. No one cared if she cried behind those velvet curtains, because to them, she wasn't a child. She was a spectacle, made to endure. As years passed, her health began to fail. The same food that had once symbolized comfort began to slowly suffocate her body. No one thought of balance. No one noticed the signs, until it was too late. She had lived surrounded by gold, but buried in silence. And when she died at just 25, there were no mourning bells, only empty corridors where laughter used to echo. She lived with excess, but died with emptiness. This wasn't just a painting. It was a confession, trapped in oil and canvas, preserved for generations to witness and to regret. Eugenia Martinez was buried without a crowd. No eulogies, no monuments. But her face never disappeared, because her portrait survived, still hanging, still watching, in the Prado Museum of Madrid, and people still stopped to stare. Today, visitors walk past her image and freeze. They read the titles, La Monstrua Desnuda, La Monstrua Vestida, and feel the sharp sting of a past too cruel to excuse. Art historians study the brushwork, but others, they look into her eyes and feel something deeper. Not fascination, not pity, but shame. Because Eugenia wasn't just painted. She was exposed, used, displayed. Her paintings have become more than art. They are warnings, relics of a time when humanity was forgotten in the name of spectacle. Her voice never reached the world, but her silence still echoes through the halls. Not just in galleries, but in every heart that dares to ask, what did we do to her? Because maybe the real monster wasn't on the canvas at all. Maybe it was standing just outside the frame, holding the brush, writing the titles, applauding the show.